Judge tries to humiliate a black woman, regrets it when she reads him his rights. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, a stark, imposing structure of gray stone that overlooked the heart of a small southern city. Its centuries-old columns bore silent witness to countless cases, some that brought justice, others that drew fierce controversy. On that particular day, the early hush in the corridors was broken only by the echo of footsteps and the occasional murmur of lawyers conferring with clients. It was the kind of setting that gave the impression of reverence for the law, but for those who entered the chambers in fear, it could be a daunting space, heavy with unspoken tension. In one of the smaller courtrooms at the far end of the hall, a young black woman named Tiana Coleman sat on a narrow wooden bench, waiting for her name to be called. The place was almost empty except for a bailiff, a stenographer fiddling with her machine, and the judge's clerk organizing case files. Tiana was dressed neatly in a burgundy blazer over a pressed white blouse with matching burgundy trousers, an outfit meticulously chosen to exude confidence while honoring her own sense of style. She had been taught from an early age that a refined appearance was an unspoken requirement in places where other people's judgments might be swift and harsh. Tiana had spent her life walking that tightrope, being pleasant but never too loud, being respectful but never meek, dressing well yet never flamboyantly. She was used to code switching, to adapting her speech in professional environments so that no one would have reason to look down on her. It wasn't that Tiana felt she owed the world an explanation. It was simply a survival mechanism, honed after years of small slights, microaggressions, and a broad awareness that her every step and word might be evaluated more critically than others. A few days prior, Tiana had received a summons to appear in court regarding a traffic offense that she fervently believed was a mistake. She had been pulled over for supposedly running a red light. The officer claimed that she ran through the intersection seconds after the signal had changed, but Tiana knew very well it was still yellow. In fact, the ticket had arrived at a particularly tough time for her finances. She was in the midst of finalizing her graduate school applications, and she had no room in her already tight budget for a hefty fine. She had decided to contest the ticket, a move that many in her neighborhood deemed pointless, as fighting any charge in Jefferson County Court was more trouble than it was worth. Yet Tiana felt a sense of moral obligation to stand up for what was right. The clerk called her name, Case 2378, State of Georgia versus Miss Tiana Coleman. A lump formed in Tiana's throat, but she stood, squared her shoulders, and moved toward the front. She could not shake the strange flutter of anxiety in her stomach, a visceral reaction to the environment, or more specifically, to the man who presided over that particular courtroom. Judge Ronald Morris had a reputation that preceded him, a commanding presence, older and heavy-set, with stern features permanently etched into a hard scowl. People whispered that he rarely showed sympathy, especially to defendants who came in without a lawyer. There was something particularly unsettling about Morris's gaze that morning. His steel-gray eyes seemed to register Tiana's presence with immediate scrutiny. She offered a polite nod and took her place at the defendant's table. A part of her hoped that if she was respectful and calm, she might avoid any hostility. Even so, another part of her felt ready. She'd spent hours the previous night combing through traffic law statutes, case examples, and anything that would prepare her to defend herself. The proceedings began matter-of-factly, with the bailiff announcing the case. Judge Morris leaned forward, peering over a pair of half-moon reading glasses. "Miss Coleman, you stand accused of ignoring a red light, nearly causing an accident," and he paused, flipping through the pages of the police report. "You have chosen to represent yourself. Is that correct?" Tiana cleared her throat, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. That's correct." His lips pressed into a thin line. He set the folder aside and clasped his hands in front of him. "Tell me, Miss Coleman, why have you decided to challenge this ticket instead of just paying the fine?" Tiana drew a small breath. "Because I did not run a red light, sir. The light was yellow when I passed through the intersection, and Judge Morris raised a hand to cut her off. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The officer's report clearly states it was red. Are you calling the officer a liar? She hesitated, suddenly aware that the few people in the room had turned their full attention to her. I'm saying that his recollection might be incorrect. The intersection in question has a short yellow light, and I was not speeding. I timed the change carefully. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. So, you are prepared to provide evidence? Yes, Your Honor. Tiana reached into the folder she carried. She was about to produce photos of the intersection, details of the traffic lights, timing that she'd obtained through the city's open records, and a log of cars around her that day. Hold on, the judge said, cutting her off once again. Before you proceed, Miss Coleman, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. This court values honesty and respects the uniform of an officer of the law. If you come in here with half-baked theories and no solid proof, you'll not only lose this case, but you might also face additional costs. Tiana's mouth went dry. She realized that Judge Morris was preparing to dismiss her argument before she even presented it. But she forced a polite smile and handed him a neatly compiled set of documents. She also provided a copy to the bailiff, who then passed it along to the prosecutor. The judge skimmed the papers for a moment, his brow furrowed. We'll come back to this. Let's place this matter on a short recess for me to examine your evidence properly. Tiana gave a small nod and stepped back, taking a seat behind the defense table while the judge called the next case. Though her heart hammered in her chest, she felt a spark of hope. At least he was looking at the documents. The clerk escorted her to a waiting room where she could spend the short recess. It was no more than a bleak rectangular space with beige walls and a chipped wooden table. She sank into one of the plastic chairs, alone with her thoughts. She wondered if she had made a mistake by not hiring a lawyer. Money was tight, but perhaps an attorney would have known precisely how to talk in that courtroom and how to address a judge so set in his ways. Just as her mind began to spiral, a voice from the doorway startled her. Miss Coleman. It was a young legal aide, a biracial woman around Tiana's age, carrying a small stack of files. She had bright, thoughtful eyes and a sympathetic smile. Mind if I sit? Tiana shook her head. Please. The woman introduced herself as Kayla Winslow, an aide assigned to the judge's clerk. I saw your evidence, Kayla whispered. It's pretty compelling. You timed the lights at that intersection yourself? Tiana nodded. Yes, and I had a friend with me who recorded a video of the timing. It shows the light changes from yellow to red in 4 seconds. I was already well past the intersection when the light was still yellow. Kayla gave a conspiratorial nod. You've done your homework. That intersection is notorious. A lot of people have complained, but the city hasn't changed the timing. It brings in too much revenue from tickets. She leaned in. Don't lose heart. I just wanted you to know that at least one person in this building sees that you're making a strong case. A wave of gratitude swelled in Tiana's chest. She smiled, her tension easing just a bit. Thank you, she said softly. Before Kayla left, she gave Tiana a piece of advice. Try to keep your composure when the judge questions you again. He might take offense if you talk back too much. Present your facts calmly and clearly. This judge, he's known for being old school. Tiana read between the lines. Old school in that context could mean many things, strict, conservative, or even biased. Tiana had felt it in his tone from the start, but she resolved to keep a respectful bearing, to give the judge no excuse to find her in contempt. When the recess ended, Tiana returned to the courtroom. Judge Morris was seated with his eyes downcast at her documents. One hand tapped lightly on the bench's wooden surface. The expression on his face was inscrutable as Tiana took her position at the defense table. The prosecutor, a tall, thin man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, stood a few feet away, flipping through the same documents. The judge cleared his throat. Miss Coleman, I reviewed your evidence, and while I see you've put a great deal of effort into assembling these materials, I'm not fully convinced they prove you're innocent. The video you submitted does not clearly show your car in relation to the light at the critical moment, nor does it show the traffic officer's viewpoint. Thus, for my initial reading, it seems insufficient. Tiana felt the blood rush to her ears. But the video does show the timer next to the intersection, and you can see me passing a specific landmark. The judge rapped his gavel on the block. "Let me finish, Miss Coleman. You are not to speak out of turn." She swallowed her protest, nodding silently. He continued, "That said, because you do provide some interesting timing data regarding the light, I'll allow you a further opportunity to clarify. But do so knowing that if I find your evidence contrived, your penalties will be steeper." His eyes bore into her, as though he were daring her to challenge him. Tiana inhaled and steadied herself. She began to explain in detail how she measured the light's duration, how she lined up the timestamps of the video with the official road camera data, which she had requested through the city's open records, to show that the light did not turn red until she was nearly across the intersection. She spoke calmly, referencing municipal code that dictated the minimum time for yellow lights, and recited it as best she could. The tension in the room was palpable. As Tiana concluded her meticulous explanation, she saw an unmistakable flicker of annoyance on Judge Morris's face, as though he disliked her calm, methodical approach. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped. "That's enough for now, Miss Coleman." He turned to the prosecutor. "I assume the state has something to say regarding the credibility of this evidence?" The prosecutor skimmed the documents. "Yes, Your Honor. We believe Miss Coleman's methodology may be flawed. She's not a certified traffic engineer, nor is she an expert witness. Laypeople often misunderstand traffic light timing. We intend to call the citing officer to the stand for clarity." Tiana clenched her fists beneath the table. She hated the way they trivialized her efforts, as though only degrees or badges could grant someone the capacity for accurate observation. But she bit her tongue, recalling Kayla's advice. Officer Tim Rogers took the stand. He was in uniform, and from the moment he began speaking, it was clear he was polished in the art of testimony. He recounted the day of a ticket in a smooth, authoritative voice, describing how Tiana's car blew through the red light, and how he had observed multiple near misses at that intersection. He downplayed any possibility that the light was yellow, stating that to the best of his professional knowledge, it had been red for at least a second before Tiana passed the intersection. The judge nodded along, occasionally making notes. When Tiana was allowed to cross-examine him, she summoned all the courage she had. "Officer Rogers, do you have any body camera footage of this alleged violation?" He paused. "My dash cam was active at the time, but it didn't capture the exact moment of the light's change. The angle was too oblique." Tiana then showed him a still frame from the city's traffic camera, which caught her car just beyond the white crosswalk line at the moment the light appeared to be shifting from yellow to red. "Do you see my vehicle here?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, pronouncing the words with a slight condescension. "And do you see the color of the light in this frame?" she pressed. He squinted, hesitated, and said, "It's ambiguous, Miss Coleman. That could be the beginning phase of the red light." There was a beat of silence, and Tiana could sense the judge's mounting impatience. She let out a slow breath, realizing that no matter how transparent she tried to be, the officer's viewpoint would stick, especially if Judge Morris was predisposed to trust law enforcement implicitly. After the cross-examination, the judge announced that he would take the matter under advisement for a few days. Tiana was both relieved and worried. She wondered how, or if, she could make any additional effort to strengthen her stance before the final hearing. Outside the courtroom, she ran into Kayla again, who shook her head sympathetically. "I tried to speak with the judge during the recess, but he's being stubborn. He called you one of those know-it-alls. I'm sorry." Tiana tried not to let the remark sting, but it cut deeper than she expected. "Thank you for letting me know," she said softly. She left the courthouse, her mind spinning. Days later, she received a phone call from the clerk's office. Her final hearing date was set for the following week. She also learned that the judge had requested more documents from the city about that intersection's recent violations. Tiana took this as a tiny sign of hope that he was at least doing due diligence. In the meantime, Tiana juggled her graduate school applications and part-time job at a local nonprofit. She was determined not to let this traffic ticket fiasco derail her future. Late into the night, she found herself at her kitchen table, scanning through her phone for any credible references. Local regulations, precedents in traffic court cases, even obscure legal analysis on timing intervals for traffic lights. Yet something weighed on her conscience that went beyond the ticket itself. She had encountered older men like Judge Morris before, people in positions of authority who let their biases cloud their judgment, particularly when dealing with younger black defendants. Tiana's mother, a retired schoolteacher, tried to comfort her over the phone. "You keep your head up and do the right thing, Tia. Don't you let anyone intimidate you into silence. You are brilliant, and you have every right to stand up for yourself." Her mother's unwavering faith reminded Tiana of all the obstacles their family had overcome: systemic discrimination, limited opportunities, prejudice from neighbors when they moved into a predominantly white area. Her mother's words ignited a small flame of resilience in Tiana's heart. When the final hearing arrived, Tiana entered the same courtroom with new resolve. A handful of spectators had gathered that day, some waiting for their own cases, others out of curiosity. Word had circulated that an uppity young woman was fighting tooth and nail against a stiff traffic charge, and that the presiding judge was none other than Morris. A hum of murmurs accompanied Tiana's steps as she moved toward the defense table. She picked up a few whispers that stung but also reinforced her purpose. The hearing proceeded more formally this time. The judge read out the summary of the case. Tiana then presented a newly acquired city record indicating a recent surge in questionable tickets at the same intersection. The prosecutor objected, citing the irrelevance of other drivers' tickets. The judge sustained the objection, but Tiana was still allowed to mention it in her statement, suggesting that a pattern of errors existed at that intersection. She spoke with eloquence and clarity, not a single word wasted. She recalled lines from municipal code, regulations about minimum yellow light intervals, and the constitutional principle that a defendant is innocent until proven guilty. Tiana put forth each argument gracefully, her voice tempered but resolute. On the inside, though, her emotions churned, remembering every condescending glance from Judge Morris, every disapproving note in his tone. When she finished, there was a brief moment of quiet. The judge exhaled audibly. "Miss Coleman, I see you've gone to great lengths, and I acknowledge your thoroughness. But let me caution you one final time. Your entire argument stands or falls on this notion that the light was still yellow. While you've made some interesting points, I find that the state's evidence, particularly the officer's testimony, is quite strong. Police officers are trained observers of traffic violations, sworn to uphold the law impartially. We must respect that expertise." He paused, and an uneasy hush settled in. Tiana felt her chest tighten. Part of her feared the worst, that he had already decided. "I'm inclined to rule in favor of the officer's account," the judge continued, leaning forward. "However, before I conclude, is there anything further you wish to say on your own behalf?" Tiana took a moment to compose herself. She thought about Kayla's warning to remain polite, about how easily things could turn sour if the judge perceived her as arrogant. But in that moment, she felt a shift, a line that she realized might need crossing. Because if she lost here, she wanted it on record that she had stood up for herself, truly, firmly, without fear. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering. "I do respect law enforcement. I appreciate their service. But I also respect the law itself, which demands fairness and critical examination of facts. You say the officer's testimony is strong. That's his job. But my job as a citizen is to ensure I'm not unjustly penalized for a violation I didn't commit. And your job, Your Honor, is to weigh everything presented, not just rely on the presumption that an officer is always correct, especially when, with all due respect, the physical evidence strongly suggests otherwise." A faint murmur rippled through the few onlookers. Tiana could almost hear some of them gasp at her directness. Judge Morris's face darkened. He moved his gavel forward on the desk, though he didn't strike it just yet. "Miss Coleman, are you lecturing this court?" Tiana swallowed, forcing herself not to flinch. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply reminding you of your oath to uphold justice without bias." For a split second, it seemed as though time itself had paused. Tiana held the judge's gaze, refusing to yield. Then, with a grin set to his jaw, Judge Morris looked down at his papers, scribbled something, and raised his eyes to deliver his verdict. "In the matter of the state of Georgia versus Miss Tiana Coleman, I find the defendant," he paused, making a show of reading his note, "guilty of the traffic violation as charged. The fine will be imposed as stated, with an additional court fee for the time wasted on what appears to be, in my opinion, an attempt to circumvent responsibility." Tiana heard a collective sigh behind her. She felt as though her ribs were constricting around her lungs, preventing air from entering. Her shoulders dropped. Tears threatened to form, but she blinked them back. Even though a part of her had been prepared for this, the sting of injustice was real. Judge Morris continued, "Now, Miss Coleman, let this be a lesson. We live in a society built on law and order. When an officer of the law cites you, the presumption is that the officer is correct unless there is overwhelming evidence otherwise. I see none here today. You are fortunate I have chosen not to add contempt charges for your borderline disrespectful remarks." That was the moment the humiliation set in, a hot flush creeping up Tiana's neck. She glanced around at the room, where some shook their heads in sympathy, others in disdain. The officer, standing off to the side, wore a smug expression. Morris lifted his gavel, about to officially finalize the sentence. But Tiana, though reeling from a swirl of disbelief, found a burst of courage. She stepped forward, raising her hand slightly. "Your Honor, may I request a final statement for the record?" He scoffed. "I've already rendered my verdict. Your statement is irrelevant." A tremor of raw emotion coursed through Tiana. She realized he was seeking to silence her in the official record. That was not justice, and she would not let it pass. Summoning all of her resolve, she spoke anyway, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and unwavering resolve. "With respect, Your Honor, I have a right under the law to ensure my words are documented. This is still my hearing, my case, and there is precedent for defendants to state their objections on record." Judge Morris's face reddened. "Fine," he snapped, "but keep it brief." Tiana inhaled deeply, and in that breath she felt something ancient and indomitable, a sense of all the ancestors who had come before her, who had fought against adversity, who had refused to be shamed or silenced. She looked straight at the judge, standing tall. "In your courtroom, it appears that an officer's testimony carries more weight than tangible evidence, video, timing logs, data that I gathered painstakingly. I'm disappointed that the law doesn't apply evenly when someone in uniform contradicts a civilian. I stand by my innocence. I will accept the penalty you impose, but I want on record that I object to the notion that an authority figure's word automatically cancels out that of a private citizen, especially a young black woman who has done nothing but abide by her civic duties. I may not have the title expert by my name, and I may not wear a badge, but I am a law-abiding citizen deserving of fair treatment. I speak not just for myself, but for everyone in my position who can afford legal counsel, who lacks the advantage of being presumed credible in a courtroom like this." She paused, allowing the echo of her words to hang in the air. "Finally," she said, her tone resolute, "I will appeal this verdict." An astonished hush fell over the room. Judge Morris's eyebrows shot up. He leaned forward, anger flashing across his features. "Appeal if you wish, but you should know it will cost you more time and money, Miss Coleman. I hope you're prepared for that." Tiana nodded. "Yes, I am." Without another word, the judge struck the gavel sharply, concluding the hearing. Yet the reverberation of that final blow lingered in the air, charged with tension. A small wave of admiration quietly emanated from a few onlookers who recognized the courage it took to speak so boldly in front of a figure like Morris. In the days that followed, Tiana began her appeal process, filing the necessary paperwork with the county circuit court. During that time, she was increasingly aware of how high the stakes had become. She now faced not only the fine, but also additional fees, and the prospect of months spent fighting a legal system predisposed to side against her. Still, she clung to the principle of the matter, the belief that if she let this slide, she would be no better than those who quietly accepted unjust outcomes. Word of Tiana's defiance reached the local media, thanks in part to Kayla, who discreetly shared a few details with a reporter she trusted. Soon, Tiana's story appeared in a small news segment on local television. They interviewed her, capturing her soft-spoken insistence on fairness and her refusal to be bullied into submission. The piece was nothing sensational. It was a straightforward recounting of her traffic case and how she believed a short yellow light and an overzealous judge led to an unjust outcome. Yet it struck a chord in the community, especially among people who had experienced similar frustrations. A few days after the story aired, Tiana received a surprising phone call. A local attorney named James Klein reached out, offering to represent her pro bono. "I've seen your story," he said in a friendly, matter-of-fact tone. "I think there might be grounds to argue this case more effectively on appeal. I believe in what you're doing, Tiana. I'd like to help." Her relief was immediate. She agreed to meet with James the next morning at his modest law office. Over coffee in a sparsely furnished conference room, he outlined a plan. "First, we'll argue that Judge Morris didn't properly weigh the exculpatory evidence. Second, we'll note the potential implicit bias, though we won't accuse him outright of that unless necessary. Third, we might look into prior complaints from defendants about that intersection and see if there's a pattern." Tiana felt an enormous weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since she started this ordeal, someone with legal expertise stood by her side. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I've been so close to giving up." James gave a sympathetic nod. "I get it. The system is designed to discourage people from challenging what might seem like minor offenses. But justice is justice, no matter how small the case. And you're not alone. Others have gone through similar experiences. Let's make sure your voice is heard properly." As the appeal date approached, Tiana and James assembled a robust file. They included well-documented evidence of the light timing, accompanied by a statement from a local traffic engineer who had tested that very intersection and concluded that the yellow light was indeed too short compared to federal guidelines. They also discovered that the officer who cited Tiana had an unusually high number of contested tickets, with multiple defendants complaining that he often wrote tickets for lights they insisted were still yellow. The day of the appellate hearing came at last, and Tiana once again found herself in a courthouse, though this time in a higher court. The atmosphere felt both more formal and more open-minded. 3 judges sat on the bench, one of them a black woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a dignified presence, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic aura of Judge Morris's courtroom. Tiana and James presented their arguments succinctly but powerfully. Their newly acquired statements and expert witnesses painted a compelling narrative that Tiana had indeed crossed on a yellow light. The shortness of the cycle was not just a small technicality. It had real implications on drivers' ability to stop safely. The city might have been exploiting this to collect revenue through traffic fines. The state side attempted to defend the original ruling, leaning heavily on the credibility of Officer Rogers and the discretion given to trial judges. But for every point they made, James Klein had a counter. At one point, Tiana saw one of the appellate judges arch an eyebrow in skepticism as the prosecutor tried to dismiss Tiana's evidence as amateurish. After the arguments concluded, the panel of judges requested a short recess to deliberate. Tiana, seated next to James, waited anxiously. She fought the memories of how powerless she felt when Judge Morris declared her guilty. Even now, she fought against the small voice that worried these appellate judges might favor the system's status quo. But when they returned and took their seats, the lead judge began reading their unanimous decision. They found that Tiana's appeal had merit. Not only did they question the fairness of the short yellow light, they specifically noted that the trial judge appeared to give undue weight to the officer's testimony, disregarding the objective data. They vacated the original verdict, dismissed the fine, and waived all court fees. A rush of relief engulfed Tiana. She felt tears forming in the corners of her eyes, and she allowed herself a small smile. She had won, thanks to her tenacity and James Klein's expert assistance. Justice had prevailed this time. The moral victory was sweeter than she could have ever imagined. Reporters outside the courtroom swarmed her for comments. Tiana, maintaining her poised demeanor, expressed gratitude to everyone who supported her. "This wasn't just about a traffic ticket," she said into a microphone. "It was about standing up for truth, even when the odds seemed stacked against me. I hope others realize that fighting for what's right is always worth it." That night, she celebrated quietly with her mother and James Klein at a local cafe. They toasted with iced tea and indulged in slices of homemade pecan pie. But a thought lingered in Tiana's mind. What about Judge Morris? She had heard from Kayla that he was furious about the appellate court's decision, claiming it undermined his authority. Part of Tiana felt vindicated, but another part felt sorrow that someone with such bias still held a gavel. A week later, as Tiana was finalizing her graduate school applications, she received yet another unexpected call, this time from Kayla. "Tiana, you won't believe what just happened," Kayla said breathlessly over the phone. Judge Morris was put under review by the Judicial Ethics Committee. Apparently, there have been numerous complaints against him for showing partiality, especially in cases involving defendants of color. Your case was mentioned as part of the pattern. Tiana's breath caught in her throat. "I don't even know what to say. Do you think they'll remove him from the bench?" "It's too early to tell," Kayla replied. "But an investigation is definitely underway." His reaction to your appellate victory raised some eyebrows. "He's been going around spouting off about how your evidence was nonsense and basically bashing the appellate court. I guess the right people finally noticed." Tiana thanked Kayla, hung up, and leaned back in her chair, letting the news sink in. A swirl of emotions filled her: relief, validation, and a pang of regret that their system allowed someone like Morris to maintain such power for so long. But she also felt a surge of pride. She had stood up and refused to be humiliated or dismissed. In doing so, she not only cleared her name, but also shone a light on systemic issues far greater than a single traffic ticket. Days passed, and Tiana moved forward with her life, uncertain if she would ever see Judge Morris again. She poured her energy into her graduate school essays, focusing on public policy and justice reform. Part of her personal statement recounted her recent legal battle, tying it to a broader vision for creating more equitable systems. She wanted to be more than just a cautionary tale. She wanted to be an agent of change. Then, a formal letter arrived at her apartment. Stamped with the gold seal of the Judicial Ethics Committee, it requested her presence at a hearing regarding Judge Morris's conduct. They wanted her testimony. Tiana's pulse quickened as she read the lines. This was unprecedented. Defendants rarely, if ever, got called to share their experiences. She immediately thought back to the humiliating day in court, how small she felt under Morris's gaze, and how her words had been summarily dismissed. Did she want to face that man again? After deliberating with James Klein, she decided she would indeed testify. "You do a lot of good by speaking your truth, Tiana," James told her. "This might be the push the committee needs to remove a biased judge from the bench, or at least sanction him." The hearing took place in a stately chamber reserved for judicial inquiries. Unlike a typical courtroom, the tables and seating were arranged so that the investigative panel faced the judge and any witnesses. Tiana, feeling a bit surreal, walked in with James by her side. Across the room, she spotted Judge Morris in a charcoal suit, looking smaller without his robe of authority. His expression was pinched and sour, a stark contrast to the imposing figure he'd been on the bench. When it was Tiana's turn to speak, she stood, heart pounding, and recounted the details of her case, how the judge had cut her off, dismissed her evidence prematurely, and clearly implied she was wasting the court's time. She also highlighted how his attitude seemed rooted in preconceived notions, especially regarding her age, race, and her decision to represent herself. Throughout her statement, she could feel Judge Morris's glare burning into her, but she refused to meet his eyes. She spoke calmly, focusing on the panel of committee members. Finally, When she was done, one of the committee members asked if she wished to add anything else. Tiana paused, gathering her thoughts. I just want to say that the law should serve everyone equally. When someone in power doesn't uphold that principle, it betrays the entire community. I was lucky to have resources, support, and enough courage to challenge him. But most people who come into his courtroom don't. My hope is that this hearing will ensure no one else feels mistreated or silenced just because they don't fit his narrow definition of respectability. She stepped down, her nerves aflame. As she passed Judge Morris on the way back to her seat, he sneered, his voice a venomous hiss under his breath. You've made a grave mistake, young lady, tarnishing a judge's reputation. Tiana turned and finally met his eyes. A flash of the old fear sparked in her, but she refused to let it consume her. I didn't tarnish anything. I spoke the truth, she replied quietly. And then she walked away. The hearing lasted nearly the entire day, with multiple witnesses testifying about Morris's pattern of bias and misconduct. In the end, the committee decided to suspend him temporarily, pending further investigation into his past rulings. While the decision fell short of outright removal, it was a significant step. Morris's iron grip on his courtroom had been fractured, if not fully broken. Tiana left that chamber with a sense of triumph that was more profound than even her appellate victory. Outside, a small throng of people gathered, some media, some citizens who had also filed complaints. One by one, they began to approach Tiana, thanking her, sharing snippets of their own stories. A middle-aged man recounted how Morris once ridiculed him for not affording an attorney. A young mother said the judge had brushed off her evidence in a child support dispute, seemingly siding with her ex, who had a higher-paying job and could afford a better lawyer. Story after story poured out, and Tiana listened, pained by how many people had suffered silently. After the crowd dispersed, Tiana found a quiet bench near the courthouse steps. The sun was setting, casting orange and pink hues across the sky. She took a moment to reflect on all that had happened. In her mind, she replayed the moment Judge Morris tried to humiliate her, the sharp tone, the underlying condescension, the gavel slamming down. But she also replayed the moment she read him his rights in her own way, refusing to be silenced. She had not allowed fear or intimidation to dictate her story. She had walked away stronger, holding on to her sense of self-worth. James found her on the bench, offering a gentle smile. He sat down beside her. You okay? Tiana exhaled slowly. I think so. It's been a whirlwind. But I'm okay. He nodded. You did more than okay. You fought for yourself, and you might have sparked a bigger change. That's no small thing. She allowed a faint smile. I just hope it lasts. I hope people don't forget next week. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Even if they do, you made a mark. You set an example that justice belongs to all of us, not just those in authority. As dusk settled, Tiana rose, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She gathered her things and walked out of the courthouse plaza, head held high. In her chest, the steady thrum of determination pulsed. She might be just one person, but she had tasted the power of speaking truth to authority, and she had seen how it could topple even the most entrenched injustices. She resolved that this would be only the beginning of her journey. There were many battles yet to fight, some small, some large, and she intended to face them with the same unwavering resolve she had shown in Judge Morris's courtroom. In the months that followed, her story continued to resonate throughout the community. Local advocacy groups began to cite her case as proof that bias in the judiciary was a real and pressing issue. The city council started discussing reforms for traffic light intervals, and more citizens felt emboldened to challenge tickets they believed were unfair. Each ripple of change, no matter how minor, felt like another victory, and Tiana's name was often invoked as a symbol of quiet but resolute resistance. She went on to complete her graduate school applications, pouring her newfound perspective into every essay. She chose public policy as her field of study, determined to use her experiences to shape better laws and hold institutions accountable. When acceptance letters began arriving, she remembered the day of that first hearing with a mixture of disgust and gratitude. disgust for the injustice, gratitude that it had propelled her forward. And in the final reckoning, the moral lesson that crystallized from her ordeal was this: refusing to be humiliated or diminished by those in power is not merely an act of defiance. It is a profound statement of one's inherent dignity. Tiana had come face to face with a towering symbol of authority, a man who believed he could shame her into submission. But she had stood firm, believing in her own worth and the fairness she deserved. In reading him his rights, reminding him that her voice mattered, she had torn a small hole in the thick curtain of prejudice that cloaked his courtroom. No one knew if Judge Morris would ever return to the bench. Regardless, Tiana's story was destined to endure, told by those who found inspiration in her quiet courage. She had proven that even a lone individual armed with truth and unwavering conviction could challenge a judge and win, leaving an imprint on a system that so often felt unchangeable. That imprint, that glimmer of possibility, was more than just a personal triumph. It was a beacon of hope for everyone still trapped in the shadows, waiting for their day in court. And so, as Tiana continued her life, preparing to move to a bigger city for graduate school, volunteering at her local nonprofit, and speaking at community forums, she carried with her the unshakable certainty that one voice could indeed tip the scales of justice, even when they seemed fixed by the heavy hand of bias. In the end, she had not just read the judge's rights, she had affirmed her own, and that in itself was a powerful victory.